directed towards either power or affiliation. And it's affiliation that I'll be focusing on today. This distinction is applicable across all types of social interactions, being particularly evident in communicative behaviors such as speech. And we're going to extend the distinction to consideration of music, suggesting that musical interaction is communicative and inherently affiliative. Unlike speech, where only one register, the phatic is unambiguously affiliative. And briefly discuss the attributes of the affiliative interaction, and we'll note that a substantial body of research indicates that musical interaction demonstrates many of these general attributes of affiliative interaction. I'll suggest that affiliative communicative interaction can appear to manifest as speech or as music. I'll refer to recent evidence from experiments conducted in the Centre for Music and Science at Cambridge that supports this hypothesis, and will suggest that features that we tend to think of as musical are best construed as affordances that facilitate the achievement of the interactive alignment indicative of affiliation in social life. Back in 1923, Malinowski introduced the notion of phatic communion, a type of speech in which ties of union are created by a mere exchange of words. To describe the use of conversation not to represent or transmit information about states of affairs, but simply to bind hearer to speaker by a tie of some social sentiment. Speech in the phatic mode, thus constituting a form of affiliative interaction. The phatic dimension of speech involves a degree of decoupling between speech acts and their everyday significances, in which the intentionality, the aboutnesses, the meanings of utterances are at best indeterminate or floating. We can think of the phatic register as a distinct affiliative register of speech, but we can also think of aspects of the phatic mode as permeating all conversational interactions. Uplands suggests that phaticity might best be seen as a constellation of interactional goals that are potentially relevant to all contexts of human interchange. Phatic goals underpin, enable the cooperativeness that Levinson sees as implicit in the fact that interactants intend their actions to be interpretable. When we engage with each other, we expect that others will understand what it is that we are doing when we engage with them. We expect that our intentions are mutually manifest between interactants in a communicative interaction particularly. So a degree of cooperativeness is essential, integral to human interaction. We can think of affiliativeness as the manifestation of a sense of connectedness between individuals, or as an expression of the human need to belong. It's been equated with a sense of social solidarity, and has been shown to be a correlate or outcome of interpersonal coordination in a range of domains. And it can also be understood as a generalized form of attachment. One particular form of interpersonal coordination that's been shown in a number of studies to be particularly efficacious in enhancing a sense of mutual affiliation is moving regularly or periodically in time with another person. Mutually adaptive rhythmic interaction. And of course, that's a typical feature of musical interaction, mutually adaptive rhythmical behavior. And indeed, there's quite a lot of evidence, and an increasing number of studies suggest that musical interaction can lead to an enhanced sense of affiliation. Even individual listening to music appears to lead to an enhanced sense of implicit affiliation, an enhanced sense of, if you like, generalized empathy. Now, rather than thinking of musical interaction as eliciting enhanced affiliation, it can be suggested conversely that affiliative interaction in general tends to have musical features, tends to have features that can be described as musical, such as a tendency for the form and the timing of interactants' behaviors to be adaptively coordinated or aligned, and the displacement of explicit, decomposable semantic meaning from its presumed central role in communicative interchanges. Adopting this point of view suggested to me that the conventional distinction between language and music, more accurately between speech and music, required to be re-evaluated, all the more so in that such a distinction doesn't seem to be straightforwardly applicable across cultures. There's quite a lot of work that suggests that many cultures don't have this clear categorization, this clear taxonomy of speech and music that we appear to have. And actually, when you look at what happens within most Western cultures, there's a whole range of phenomena between what we might think of as music and speech. But this in turn led me to the hypothesis that affiliative communicative interaction as a distinct domain of human interaction might be interpreted as speech or as music, depending on the practices available and the distinctions drawn within particular cultures. That is, rather than music and speech constituting distinct domains that manifest as such in different societies, we tend to project onto a universal domain of affiliative communicative interaction, a distinction between speech and music typical of agrarian but centralized and urban societies marked by the presence of music specialists, a prevalence of presentational musical frames, and the existence of hierarchies of musical genres and values. We can characterize these societies historically as being presentational, elitist, centralizing, urban, literate, individualistic, agrarian, and role specialized. They're not weird, they're just peculiar societies. This hypothesis has numerous significant implications, not the least of which is that speech and music absolutely require to be jointly explored as communicative resources. But in the present paper, I'm going to confine myself to discussing recent research that supports this hypothesis and attempting to develop ways of understanding what we take to be properties of music as features that are optimal for achieving interactive alignment and hence affiliation in interaction. In a series of studies at Cambridge, which we call the Joining In Project, this is conducted largely with my colleague Sarah Hawkins and several of our research students and collaborators elsewhere. We explored interaction in spontaneous speech and in music, recording pairs of same-sex friends aged between 18 and 31 who are either both musically trained or not musically trained, talking, doing other tasks, and making music together. We found that intonation peaks, speech accents that occurred between speakers in the vicinity of musical bouts were likely to be aligned with the musical pulse, suggesting that both domains were likely to be underpinned by common temporal processes. We then analyzed aspects of the conversational interactions that we'd recorded, exploring the dynamics of turn transitions, when one speaker cedes the floor to another, when one speaker ceases to speak and another begins. We found that when participants were interacting in the phatic register, they were just chatting, they weren't talking about anything particular, they were just chatting because they liked to talk together. These were same-sex friends, remember? That at turn transitions and question-answer pairs, the last few speech accents of a first speaker's utterance often exhibited a transitory periodicity or beat that could predict the timing of the initial speech accent of the second speaker's response. More formally, we found that when speech interaction between speaker A and speaker B was in the phatic register, and speaker B answered a question from speaker A so as to indicate alignment of attitude, the first speech accent of speaker B's turn fell at a temporal location predictable from the timing of the last 2 or 3 speech accents of speaker A's turn. So something like this is going on. Towards the end of the question, we have a series of pulses emerging. And we find that speaker B produces a first speech accent at precisely the point that we would predict from the last 2 or 3 speech accent timings, the timing of the last 2 or 3 speech accents of speaker A. Interestingly, when speaker B wanted to indicate that they didn't agree, was producing a dispreferred answer, was disaligned, they were also out of time, late or early. Now, we also found that in such instances, when you got this periodic question-answer pair transition, the modal fundamental frequency of the second speaker's utterance was also likely to form a musical pitch interval with the modal F0 of the first speaker's turn. So something like this is going on. When they're attitudinally aligned, the modal pitch, modal frequency really, of speaker A and speaker B form a musical interval. When they were disaligned, it was not a musical interval. So effectively, attitudinally aligned turn transitions appear to exhibit coordination across turns in rhythm and in pitch, a type of coordination usually considered to be associated with music rather than conversational interaction. These findings led to an experimental collaboration with a group of Chilean researchers, in which we explored the effect of spontaneous musical interaction on subsequent conversations, using both phonetic conversation analysis and motion capture. In a motion capture suite, we asked pairs of same-sex strangers to have a brief conversation and then either to improvise music together or build a tower out of Jenga blocks and then to talk again. So we've got two separate groups. One group comes in, talks, makes music together, then talks. Another comes in, talks, plays with Jenga blocks, and then talks. We then compare the first and second conversations in both conditions, in both groups. In the second conversations in the musical interaction group, we found an increased proportion of turn transitions organized around a shared beat, whereas the proportion of periodic question-answer pairs in the frequency of rhythmic turn transitions in the second conversations of the Jenga group, the hands-busy group, actually decreased. We also found coordination of torso movement in the second conversations tightly coupled after the musical interaction. This wasn't the case after the Jenga interaction. You can see it more clearly in this diagram here, where the different colored lines represent cross-correlation in terms of torso movement. So in the Jenga block group, the blue line and the red line are the respectively before and after conversations. The sort of greenish, green yellow line and the green line are the before and after torso movements, cross correlations in the music group. And as you can see, there's a hugely significant difference. We're getting a significant coordinated body sway at time point 0. That is, they're coupled together as one moves forward, one moves back, as one moves left, the other moves right, and vice versa. And interestingly, about 1.2 seconds later, we're getting the opposite. One moves forward, the other moves forward, one moves back, the other moves back, and so on. But we're getting a huge degree of correlated movement, correlated body sway. So after musical interactions, pairs of same-sex strangers showed a substantially increased temporal coordination in both their unconscious movements and their conversation, compared to a similar group who'd simply played a non-competitive but reportedly enjoyable manipulative game. In effect, the group who'd made music together were behaving more like friends than strangers. Our original experiment demonstrated that spontaneous interaction in speech and music exhibited features that overlap to the extent that we can be pretty confident in suggesting that they derive from similar sources. The affiliative, phatic speech interactions of same-sex friends can be marked by use of shared pulse and alignment and pitch, albeit they're both momentary and likely to be below the threshold for conscious awareness. They might be recognizable, however, retrospectively. The subsequent Chilean studies showed that interposing a short session of spontaneous improvised music making between two conversations involving pairs of same-sex strangers led to the second conversations manifesting more features of affiliative interaction in both speech and in movement than did another interpolated cooperative interaction. Coordinated body sway, by the way, has been established as a feature of interactants who are engaged in affiliative conversations in a number of studies. One might ask if these features these phonetic coordination, rhythmicity, this body sway are truly musical, in line with the hypothesis that affiliative communicative interaction should be conceived of as a distinct domain of human interaction that can be interpreted as either speech or as music. One could suggest that these might simply be features of human communicative interaction that are oriented towards achieving affiliative interpersonal alignment. So these musical features in speech interaction, alignment in time and pitch in speech, and coupling of movement of time, might simply be features of human affiliative communicative interaction in general. I now want to sketch some preliminary ideas about how we might explain features that we tend to associate with musical structure, rhythmic patterns organized around a steady beat, and the use of stable pitches and distinct pitch patterns, as oriented towards setting up and sustaining affiliative interactions from dyadic to group level. These can thus be considered as types of interactive affordance that are proper to the domain of affiliative communicative interaction, oriented towards achieving affiliation and interaction, rather than being proper either to speech or music, most likely having arisen through selection pressures for sociality in human evolution, because humans are preternaturally social animals. So, affordances in joint action. The concept of affordances originates with J.G. Gibson, who states that affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes, either for good or ill. Affordances can be thought of as the meanings of things for action. They can be natural or cultural. And Gibson himself noted that the richest and most elaborate affordances of the environment are provided by other animals and, for us, for humans that is, by other people. This perspective opens up the possibility of considering the ways in which affordances can play a role in joint action, with each agent in such an action potentially providing affordances for each other agent. Kerry Marsh and her collaborators noted that affordances are intrinsically social, where the ecosystem is composed of multiple cooperative conspecifics, which is by and large the position for most humans most of the time. As Marsh Group puts it, the presence of another person changes the affordance structure of the environment. Each individual brings to a situation certain effectivities, action capabilities, and thus, when one moves from solo action to having another person present, there are new possibilities for action that can be realized, affordances at the level of the new synergy. Interpersonal and social affordances thus underpin joint action. While the affordances might be functional for each participant in a joint action by virtue of the actions of the other and thus be social, they might become interactive in the sense that their influence is mutually and co-equally evident in shaping each participant's behaviors. I shall work towards that point. Tollefson and Dale suggest that joint action, including that which takes the form of conversation, may involve multiple levels of alignment between participants, but rests on low-level processes of bodily alignment. And the existence of some sort of alignment system, perhaps related to a mirror system, has been postulated. But Tollefson and Dale suggest that the alignment system may be a system only in the sense that it's a loosely interconnected set of cognitive processes that have evolved to facilitate the carrying out of group activities. If all these processes are working together during joint action, then the alignment system is a heterogeneous mix of diverse components and training two or more people to specific patterns of action. Now, what they're actually suggesting here is that even metacognitive contractual understandings of a group's behavior as it relates to one's own requires low-level processes to be present in the first place. For example, body sway, phonetic convergence on rhythmic structures. Joint action is underlain by simple patterns of surface synchrony at its lowest level, while the deep commitments, goals or intentions, those identified by philosophical theories, may emerge from these low-level patterns. But we have to have the low-level patterns in the first place before we can get to these metacognitive contractual understandings. Schmidt suggests that Something like an expectation of trustworthiness should be a default position. Now that fits with much evidence in the literature that suggests that as flexibly social animals, humans must be intrinsically cooperative. That is, more biased to engage with each other in terms of a tendency to be mutually affiliative, rather than a tendency for one or the other participant to try to dominate the other. Abramov and Slors further suggest that coordination ensues when, given a shared intention, the actions of and/or affordances for one agent shape the field of affordances for other agents. So in effect, it can be proposed that social affordances of the types involved in interpersonal coordination and joint action can be conceived of as emergent and dynamic constraints on individual and joint action. Ronkoshek, Leonardi, and collaborators suggest that the types of social affordances evident in human communication emerge in early human development. They note that a child does not learn to behave toward a caregiver, but rather with a caregiver. That is, the child learns to be part of a relational whole. They go on to suggest that infants' perceptions become socially shaped by the infant's own movements being treated as responses to, and at the same time, affordances for mother's behavior, by mothers enacting the consequences of a child's movement. In this case, interpersonal affordances are explicitly interactive affordances, emerging through and shaping the actions of participants, of both participants, as an ongoing interaction unfolds in time. Following on from a developmental account of affordances that may be interactive, Gabriel contextualizes the idea of interpersonal affordances as in evolutionary terms, suggesting that interaction between people takes place in a socio-cultural niche, wherein communication and social position provide signals that may quickly be read as affordances. Social affiliation is crucial for evolutionary success in humans, and therefore perception of possibilities for social interaction may be an evolutionary feature of mind, what has sometimes been called the social mind. With the idea established that affordances can be social or interpersonal, we can now be more specific about the attributes and functional features of interactive affordances. These are features of the social environment that are mutually apparent and mutually accessible to agents in social interaction. They facilitate joint action that's likely to be affiliative and communicative, affording a mutual decrease in behavioral unpredictability throughout the duration of an interaction and enabling mutual adaptation in real time. In effect, I have to be enabled to fit with you in the ways in which you are enabled to fit with me, and our behaviors must function as affordances for each other. If potentially interactive affordances are not equally accessible to all agents, they may be social or interpersonal, though not interactive. And interactive affordances are likely to be low-level and pre-reflective, though culturally malleable. So I'm thinking back to our situation where we have periodic turn transitions in phatic conversational interactions. You can think of the pulse that emerges towards the end of speaker A's turn and is picked up by speaker B as constituting an interactive affordance that may be oriented towards the achievement of interpersonal alignment. Interactive affordances are likely to be motivational in the broad sense in that they dispose agents towards potential actions, whether or not any intentions implicated in the operational motivations are consciously accessible is probably moot. Interactive affordances can scaffold higher level interactive modes that range across a number of domains. And interactive affordances can be coordinative in organizing joint action towards a goal extrinsic to an interaction. However, it can be the case that processes required to achieve an extrinsic interaction goal may interfere with access to the interactive affordances for one or more of the agents involved. If we think back to the case of the periodic turn transition, if we're not conversing in the phatic mode, that is, if what we're saying actually matters, if it touches on quite specific features of our environment, whether mental or physical, then we might have to use particular vocabularies. Those particular vocabularies might get in the way of us being able to set up a periodic pulse towards the end of an utterance that could then be picked up by our interactant or conversant. Hence, effectively, the processes required to achieve an extrinsic interaction goal can interfere with access to the interactive affordances for one or more of the agents involved. Interactive affordances are thus more likely to be operational in joint activities oriented towards a goal intrinsic to an interaction, such as the successful continuation of an interaction. In effect, interactive affordances are differentiable from social or interpersonal affordances in that they induce a necessary mutuality, reciprocity, or co-adaptiveness. And they're more likely to be operational in interactions that are oriented towards enhancing affiliation rather than towards achieving an external goal, a goal external to the interaction. Now, affiliative interactions likely to rely on a mutual reduction in behavioral unpredictability between two interactants by the use of whatever suite of multimodal resources are jointly available and are adequately effective in allowing a reduction in unpredictability, together with enhanced activation of the neural and endocrinal systems underlying approach motivations required, if you like, for a sense of the emergence of a sense of mutual affiliation. Prediction is a fundamental component of our interactive capacities. There's some very interesting work by Jeremy Skipper showing that in conversations, particularly between people's conversants who are familiar with each other, it seems that what we experience as being said is likely to derive more from what we expect to hear than from what actually happens. And it's at least partly determined by co-occurring mouth movements and beat gestures. Such predictive processes also characterize much music listening, underpinning emotional responses and the experience of structure. So a listener's emotional responses are clearly mediated by the expectedness of ongoing melodic structures, and it's been found that a hierarchy of expectations exists in the auditory system for both musically trained and untrained listeners, from low-level features such as interval size to higher-level features such as frequency of occurrence and degree of centrality and tonal structure. Hence, both rhythm and pitch can be thought of as interactive affordances, not as pattern-bearing or pattern-producing media, but as media for enhancing the achievement of the likelihood of achievement of interactive affiliative alignment. Rhythm and pitch as interactive affordances. Now, it seems pretty straightforward to make a case for rhythm as an interactive affordance, given the standard eigenmodes in human movement that Petri Toiviainen and others point out. The resources exist in our bodies for us parsimoniously to organize our movements and our attentional resources so as to enable alignment with each other through now well-studied and reasonably well understood processes of entrainment. With preferences for inter-event intervals that slow across our lifespans, but that typically range between 200 to 800 millisecond inter-event interval. We can think of rhythm as manifested in music as deriving not from abstract structural considerations, nor actually from our own bodily dynamics, but from the interactual affordances that it offers for affiliative interpersonal alignment. So rhythm seems pretty straightforward. A means of achieving temporal coordination. the sort of temporal coordination that reduces unpredictability and that seems to underpin the emergence of affiliative engagement. Making a case for pitch seems somewhat more complex, but becomes clearer if we substitute the term vocal auditory system for the term pitch. Human vocal auditory systems are extremely flexible in terms of the sounds we can produce, receive, and discriminate between. We're capable of volitionally producing a vastly broader range of sounds than can be produced by any other primate. Our vocal auditory capacities arose in the human lineage between about 1.6 and 0.5 million years ago, initially characterized by enhanced breathing control. And as a consequence, we're able to produce and to perceive a very wide range of vocal sounds and to articulate these sounds extremely rapidly, not only in speech, but across a range of nonverbal contexts. Our vocal and auditory capacities appear intimately coupled, not only in having taken modern day form at similar times in human evolution, but also in the extent to which they jointly contribute to our capacity to coordinate with each other in interaction. Our ability to use pitch to fit with aspects of our auditory social environment appears early. Mampe et al. Showed that 3D-old infants reflected aspects of the prosodic pitch characteristics of their local language environment in their non-distress crying behaviors. So right from the start, humans continue to be surprisingly good at matching the vocal pitches they encounter. May not seem to be the case because most studies of vocal reproduction of heard pitch have started from the premise that the desideratum is accuracy rather than experienced fit, very much in line with the expectations of Western or peculiar music education. However, Janina Fick found almost 40 years ago that musically untrained children could either mimic, target, or match pitches that they heard with high degrees of consistency. Mimicking involved reproducing the exact pitch. Targeting involved an overt attempt to do so and kind of missing, whereas matching could involve the production of a quite different pitch that was simply perceived as fitting, simply experienced as fitting with the one perceived. Moreover, people who have severely limited capacities to perceive musical pitch accurately, amusical individuals, appear able to consistently match their vocal productions to pitches that they hear with a significant degree of consistency. So amusical individuals can consistently sing pitches that they experience as fitting or matching to auditory targets. They might be completely off, completely out of tune, but they're roughly the same every time. In other words, they sing pitches they experience as fitting and matching and do so dependably. And this apparent universality of the capacities for vocal pitch mimicking, targeting, and matching is consonant with the idea that pitch in music is a primarily interactive medium, enabling interactive alignment with others. Pitch in human interaction is typically vocal, affective, and attitudinal. That is, it signals our internal states and our intentions towards others. In general, sound types in affiliative interaction should be minimally chaotic, that is, non-noisy with a narrow range of intensity levels. And the production of sonic patterns that can be identified and matched is likely to be facilitated by the use of reasonably stable, long-duration features of the vocal signal. Discrete harmonic pitches work quite nicely here. Pitch appears to be one of the most flexibly usable media for the formation of complex patterns, to be a morphophoric or pattern-bearing medium, in the range from about 60 Hz to about 3 kHz in terms of fundamental frequency, which is about the same as the range over which Western musical instruments operate, and over which both place and time mechanisms in the auditory periphery contribute to the pitch percept, and hence allow us to hear complex pitch differences and complex pitch patterns. Stable pitches in this range are consistently vocally reproducible. They constitute good targets for imitation and matching. They're not inherently affectively marked, hence fitting within the low arousal positive valence quadrant of the circumplex model. And patterns of pitches are thus capable of being adapted to bear a range of significances. When pitch is modulated to create patterns, matching requires predictability. Predictability should be enhanced by the use of discrete pitch levels, absolute or specific intervals, relative, or by repeated contoural patterning. Such pitch patterns are likely to facilitate a listener's inference about the state of the producer according to motivational structural principles or socio-intentional norms, and hence be capable of carrying implications of cooperation in terms of commitment to the communicative act. It should be noted, of course, that pitch patterns or communicative patterns are likely to be multimodal. In general, pitch patterning would most probably co-occur with some level of gestural patterning. Though the question of the extent to which cross-modal associations between pitch and gesture are grounded in cultural schemas or are more loosely bound to cross-cultural, perhaps species-specific constraints, remains open. Various sources tend to suggest that melodies unfold at a slower rate than does speech. Natural speech occurs at an estimated speed of about 80 to 150 milliseconds per syllable, whereas pitches and melodies seem to occur somewhat more slowly in general. Mary Farbood and collaborators note that the range of modulation spectrum of speech across languages tends to be between 4 and 8 hertz, that is about 125 to 250 milliseconds. While for melodic sequences, the ideal range is about 0.5 to 6.7 hertz, that is 150 to 2000 milliseconds, in general, rather slower. This rather slower rate for melody may help pitch to be identified unambiguously, which again fits with the idea of pitch as a medium for vocal matching. We can thus think of melodies as differentiable patterns in pitch that embody different and varying levels of predictability, designed to provoke continual engagement in processes of mimicking, targeting, or matching in interaction. The fact that pitch serves lexical functions in tone languages supports the idea that pitch is one of the primary dimensions allowing for consistent identification of form in communicative contexts. The lexical tone interacts with melodic pitch in complex and very subtle ways. But while pitch in the form of lexical tone may also play a role in articulating semantically decomposable propositions, it also plays a hugely significant role in expressing both affect and attitude. Modulation of vocal pitch can be indicative of effort. It may indicate affiliative commitment to communication. It can provide significant clues as to speaker attitude, and it may underpin the expression of emotional meaning in general. We can think of song as heightened or stylized speech, a form of oral communication that abstracts what's being said from its everyday lexical import and softens or obfuscates meaning. Similarly, we can think of phatic speech in the phatic mode as evanescent song, a form of oral communication with predictable features that can afford interactive engagement. Whatever perspective we adopt, phatic speech and song are underpinned by a battery of culturally shared formulae of varying predictability that are suited for joint performance. These are then likely to become assimilated to and governed by schematic frameworks within which they can be distinguished, ordered, and ranked. These considerations allow us to reframe what appear to be fundamental concepts in music theory as reflecting not abstract structural considerations, but constraints reflecting interactive affordances oriented towards affiliative interpersonal alignment. So discrete pitches provide an affective and attitudinal substrate for pattern formation in the production, perception, and most importantly, imitation and matching of signals in affiliative interaction. Scales can be viewed as optimal structures for the formation of predictable and distinct patterns in cognition on which a culture converges in creating, conserving, and disseminating melodies that facilitate sensory consonance, involve unequal step structures, and their cyclicality endows them with group theoretic properties such as uniqueness, simplicity, and coherence that are key to creating complex and distinguishable patterns. Entrainment can be conceptualized as the interactive working out of sets of mutually temporally predictable structures, or conversely as a capacity that is emergent from reciprocal alignment between eigenmodes of human movement in affiliative contexts. And finally, rhythm and meter can be viewed as the results of processes of anticipation and entrainment working in the context of the perceptual present, so as to bind together predictably structured patterns of events over short timescales that facilitates matching and hence alignment. To provide an interim conclusion and to tease out some implications, these considerations suggest that in exploring and analyzing music, our focus should not so much be on patterns in pitch and rhythm, but on the affordances that such patterns may provide for matching and mimicry. Patterns, melodies, songs, pieces, constitute the residues or traces of the operation of interactive affordances that then may come to serve as cultural templates for future interactions. Pitch and rhythm, as they manifest themselves in melody, are not just the articulation of complex patterns, but the co-construction of patterns through processes of mimicking, targeting, and matching. On the whole, while the nature of pitch and rhythm as interactive affordances is more transparent in participatory than in presentational contexts, even in the latter, presentational context, the foundations of musical styles can be thought of as likely to derive from the constraints imposed by the requirements of interactive affordances. Some general hypotheses fall out of these ideas. We'd expect to find that entropy in terms of pitch and rhythmic structure should be moderately low, so as to facilitate matching or mimicry when we're oriented towards affiliative alignment. Cross-culturally, melodies should manifest a similar degree and range of entropy, irrespective of apparent cultural variability in structure. We should also expect to find that pitch and rhythm constitute preferred morphophoric domains across world cultures in contexts of affiliative communicative interaction, not just in music, but also in speech, what we might think of as speech. And we should also expect to find a greater number of instances of coordination in both pitch and time in affiliative, phatic contexts than in non-affiliative, agonistic contexts. And there's already some evidence for this in the work of Paxton and Dale. Overall, the idea that the materials of music are selected in order to create beautiful structures and sound to be produced by the few and consumed by the many can be challenged by a focus on music's features as foundationally concerned with affiliative interaction. We can think of the beautiful structures we find in musical structures as contingent properties, contingent products of the constraints on how humans can effectively and consistently engage with each other over the long term in affiliative interaction. In evolutionary contexts, such constraints are likely to underpin the intense sociality and fundamental cooperativeness that characterizes the human species. Hence, what we tend to think of as music might be a very culturally particular manifestation, development, refinement, aestheticization, and alas, commodification of the human capacity for affiliative interactive engagement. If there's a telos to melos, it's not beauty, but sociality. The fact that melody can also be beautiful is rather a bonus. Thank you for listening.
Many thanks for a great talk. And I hope someone, if you have any questions, anyone, you
please.
can either type into the chat as we're used to, or ask. I'll try to see if anyone has any questions. There are a lot of applause. There is one raised hand by someone who I need to find. Nicola, yes.
Hi, hello.
Hi, Nikki.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much. It's really interesting because in this network, we've been thinking about how we might, how data in, for example, artificial intelligence and music might be thought about and thought about in ways that are much more social and yeah. So what you've been talking about fits completely with that kind of trying to imagine what this might mean. And I wanted to go back, so to your point about the phatic and the non-phatic. I can't remember where the word for the non-phatic is, but so how does that sort of map onto kind of particular genres of music or kind of uses of music? Or could you sort of elaborate a little bit more about the phatic and the non-phatic, I suppose, in its kind of social context of music making? Just to help me understand it a bit more. Thank you.
Okay, well, if we are to think of music as foundationally affiliative, then it is intrinsically phatic. It can be adapted for use in contexts where its underlying sociality is exploited. I'm thinking perhaps of, we've all seen the John Lewis advert, etc. No, they really don't feel that affiliative towards us. They want us to spend money. But the intrinsic affiliativeness of music is what is being exploited in these contexts. In general, music, particularly music as interaction, is affiliative. It can't be anything other. It's oriented towards itself, oriented towards continuation of the interaction. If we think, on the other hand, of an interaction that is oriented towards the achievement of some sort of some goal external to the interaction, a goal extrinsic to the interaction, then that's likely to get in the way of any affiliativeness. It's likely to require a degree of affiliativeness, cooperativeness, to get the joint action going. But then the focus moves on to the goal, the extrinsic goal of that joint action. And the qualities of affiliativeness, which I would describe as mutuality and reciprocity, are likely to evaporate as hierarchies and roles become distinct and power begins to be exercised and dominance begin to be exercised differentially within the interacting group. Now, of course, you could point to an orchestra and say, well, that's precisely what's going on. And it is indeed, but that's an interesting historical construct that has emerged over several centuries, possibly 100, possibly much longer, as a way of doing music in a very specific type of context. Effectively a court context. It's a court music, and it has more orchestral music probably has more relationship with gamelan and gagaku than it does with football chants. The football chants are much more phatic. Okay, to the opposing fans, they are anything but. But for the group who's actually singing the same song, the same words, there is a sense of mutual affiliation, a sense of reciprocity. There, the togetherness is being co-opted into a straightforwardly competitive situation. And one does find this in a number of different contexts. Football chants is one, congado, the rituals that Glaurau Lucas and Martin Clayton have worked on, is another, where different groups of different groups of people are processing through a town, each with their own music. When they meet, they have to greet each other. But what they must not do is let their music be absorbed by the others. So they have to keep their pulses separate. It's a rather complicated issue. But in general, music is affiliative, I would suggest.
That's great. Help? Brilliant examples. Thank you. Yeah.
Good. Fine.
Maybe I will ask some questions. So to me, when you talked about affiliative interactions and the way you describe them, they are reminiscent of flow situation. Yeah. Do you also kind of see that as kind of a similar similarity, or do you see the kind of distinctions there?
I can see it, yes, absolutely. Particularly when you have forms of affiliative interaction in music where you get what you might call a merging of experienced agency. You're not quite sure who's doing what, but it doesn't actually matter, in a sense. In most non-musical situations, that really would matter. You need to know who's driving the train. But actually, who's producing that particular pattern, once you get into the groove, it probably doesn't really matter very much. And it's something that begins to approximate to a state of flow. It's not something we found very much of in our particular experiments, because we were finding that the musical bouts lasting maybe 30, 45 seconds, maybe a minute at most, were occurring. But this was entirely spontaneous, unprepared, and working with mostly people who were non-musicians. Although interestingly, the musicians that we work with, the pairs of musicians, tend to be much more self-conscious about spontaneously, unquote, making music together, just in case they were being judged or even worse, marked. Yeah.
We have a question from Haifa.
Yep. Dal, hi.
Hi, Ian. How are you?
Hi, very well. How are you?
I'm good. Beautiful, really beautiful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about that continuum that you presented between language and music and about interactive affordances.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you think the gist of the difference between these two are. And I'm thinking in the lines of what you said about intrinsic and extrinsic goals.
Yeah.
So perhaps music has ultimately, as a participatory medium, right?
Yeah.
Communal participatory social medium, it
Yes.
has an intrinsic goal.
Yeah.
And maybe the gist of the difference is that maybe language has more naturally more extrinsic goals, specificity, but it's a really beautiful continuum that embodies interactive affordances on both ends.
Yeah.
I wonder, yeah.
Well, thank you for appreciating what I was trying to say much more clearly than I suspect I did. But it's precisely that. If one thinks of the continuum between what we think of as music and what we think of as language, it's really a continuum between a medium within which interaction is intrinsically oriented and a medium within which interaction can be extrinsically oriented. Point is, in a musical interaction, if it becomes extrinsically oriented, you're probably doing it for money, as it were. The musicality of it, the music is constrained within particular societal or cultural structures. And what we think of as language is more open in that it can open the interaction out into the natural world, but then in turn almost necessarily imposes or permits the formation of a non-reciprocity of distinctive and hierarchically structured social relations, whereas in participatory music and the ideal, it is open.
Sorry, I was muted. But if you were to define in an experiment or an exercise, a conversation is completely intrinsically motivated by somehow, you would have came in onto very similar interactive affordances, maybe as a musical interaction, right?
Exactly. And that's what you get in a phatic conversation that's entirely phatically oriented. It's just people talking rubbish to each other and having a nice time socially. It's just that the noises they make are interpretable as speech when they're actually doing something that speech is generally not thought to do.
So redefining the definitions of music and language.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's suggesting that what we think of as music and language, what we think of as music and as phatic speech are actually subdomains of a superordinate domain of affiliative communicative interaction. And the same processes underpin both. And we can divide that continuum up in different ways. And we do so in different societies, different cultures.
Not in the Western society, but in other societies. Maybe.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, a really nice example is by Gunther Senft. And he was looking at communicative registers in the Trobriand Islands, which is where Malinowski developed his original notion of the phatic back in 1923. And there's a nice paper by Senft in 2018, where he notes that the predominant interactive speech communicative register in the trobrians is what's called bigasopa. It's joking or lying speech, indirect speech, not saying anything unambiguously, ambiguous speech.
Right.
And a subcomponent of that is wosi, songs. So there you've got a taxonomy where what we think of as phatic speech embraces songs. You know, music is tucked away in a wee corner of speech, of phatic speech. And phatic speech is the main way that people interact with each other as a means of avoiding conflict on the whole.
Wow, interesting.
Or minimizing conflict. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions while we have Ian at our beck and call?
Yeah.
Yeah, Nicola, you beat me.
Yeah, I suppose I'm just I suppose then if we're saying that music is intrinsically phatic, then thinking about the other kinds of uses and functions that music have, would you say that you know that when we're listening to, for I don't know, you know, background music in a shop or whatever it is, or you know, that we are experiencing it with hearing that communication, obviously that communicative, that affiliation, experiencing some kind of virtual or projected or whatever kind of affiliative affordance, despite the fact that we're not actually interacting with someone, on. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay. Yeah,
exactly. And there's a nice paper by John Wostkowski and Eric, I think, Eric Clark, which suggests precisely that simple listening can enhance a sense of affiliation. And why else would you use music in a shop? Let's face it. I mean, there are two reasons. One is to drown out the screams of other shoppers, but the other is to make you feel warm and fuzzy about the shop because it feels warm and fuzzy about you. Of course it doesn't. It's just lying. That's the point, that humans are very good at using anything to lie to each other. It's rather depressing.
Yeah, so now, of course, I'm so, you know, what you then do, of course, is try and search desperately for the counter examples, don't you? You know, I'm now thinking, are there, you know, well, where are the, I mean, that makes it even more interesting, doesn't it, to think about those composers or music making places where music is deliberately working against those affordances. Well,
I mean, there's a, well, I was going to say lovely, but it's not lovely, an apposite example from the work of Paul Richard, anthropologist, who'd worked on conflict in Sierra Leone and has written very interesting about the use of music there. And there's one particular instance of, I mean, it was vile. This is the 90s. A young woman who was abducted, raped, brutally treated, and was inducted into the group that had abducted her by means of song. She had to learn to sing the songs. And she was beaten if she didn't get them right, but eventually learned to sing them. But then many years later, when singing them, feels overcome by emotion, by a sense of belongingness. I mean, now that is perversion. That's real perversion.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's a kind of a use of the affiliative function or of affordances, affiliative affordances, to really awful ends. Absolutely. Yes. I'm kind of also thinking, or I was thinking more about, where are the places where music, or people use music in ways which are deliberately not affiliative. I mean, that is an affiliative use, but to a kind of purpose.
Yes.
So I'm looking for the counter examples, if there are any, of, you know,
I'm not sure there are. I'm not sure there are, because it's, I think it's always in there somewhere.
Yeah, interesting.
You can't get rid of it. What it's used for, how it may not manifest as affiliation, but I think
you
it's
can't turn it off.
Yeah. Right? That constitutes one of the underlying drivers of the power of music. But you could think of it as just going back to almost infant John Bowlby's attachment.
Yeah, but I was kind of, sorry, I will stop in a second, so I realise it's into a conversation. I was thinking about, you know, the kind of 12-tone and stereo, or not even 12-tone, but, you know, the kind of music which deliberately tries to resist in some ways. Kind of, Do you know what I'm getting at?
I know precisely what you're getting at.
Yeah.
It's odd. I mean, the stuff that for me that does manage to resist is the stuff that's really not very good. Whereas the really good stuff, Webern or Le Marteau à Maître,
Yeah.
it's just fabulous. You know,
Yeah.
despite the best efforts of Webern and Boulez, there is a beauty in there. Somehow one can manage it. It's a bugger to play, but so in terms of mimicking and matching, perhaps we're on the edge of possibilities. But somehow I just remember hearing 45 years ago, a performance of Le Marteau à Maître by a group which had done it, you know, hundreds of times. And it was like listening to a Schubert song cycle. It was just so easy. Oh, that's simple. That's wonderful. That worked. So yeah, even the ostensibly rebarbative music, I mean, within limits, you know, there is some head-banging stuff out there that's probably not terribly affiliative.
But also the affiliation can change, you know, through
yeah,
generations.
it's true. Yes,
you know,
it's true.
I must perceive it or experience it differently than you, or
Yeah.
younger people than me. You know, it's completely different. So forms of affiliation are just, you know, malleable in a sense.
Yeah, it's true. Culturally malleable. Yeah. But I think probably within limits, you know, we're never quite going to end up with heavy metal lullabies, but we might. Who knows? Who knows?
Maybe a lullaby is not the most affiliated medium.
That's quite possible. Yes, possible. Yeah. But I think death metal is probably not that affiliative intrinsically.
Well, okay, far from me to defend death metal, but I mean, for the group who is engaged in, you know, attending the concert, it's probably feels
absolutely, extremely.
But I want to maybe throw kind of one last, I don't know if it's even a question. So following from the event we had last week in Sweden, and there was one. Sorry, I'm kind of doing a bit of self-promotion, but one of the things we presented there was a work of kind of improvisation between a pianist and my programming. So it's kind of live interaction, totally improvised. The computer is completely responsive to the result. And the pianist suddenly admitted that that he senses a sense of dialogue with a partner. And I was listening to the recordings, and there are kind of parts where the computer and the pianist share in a melody somehow, like notes, alternating notes, which is, I think, quite an example of affiliative interaction, the way that you're saying. And does it, I mean, for the pianist, it's, he admitted that it's both exciting and pretty frightening.
Yes.
The sense that he can find himself, in your words, affiliated with a machine.
Yep.
Do you also think it's kind of troubling or problematic or difficult to talk in this kind of language about non-human interaction?
I do. Extremely problematic, because we have no control. When we're interacting with another person, well, when we're interacting in general, our assumptions are that the other person shares the same deontological commitments, the same ethical commitments that we have. When you're interacting with a machine, you cannot make that assumption. It might have, but I don't think anyone's managed to produce an ethical machine, certainly not Elon Musk. So the possibility of a machine that is capable of sustaining the low-level coordinative processes that do seem to underpin the emergence of affiliative alignment is deeply troubling. And it's something that I think would really need to be policed outside the bounds of a concert, obviously. Within a concert, for goodness sake, it's not going to follow you off stage and demand your bank details. But within in the real world, as soon as you start moving towards being able to produce machines that can embody these ostensibly affiliative characteristics and hence elicit attitudes and assumptions that would be proper in respect of other people, but that are not proper in respect of machines, that's something that needs to be tested and explored and set into some sort of legal framework. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it is interesting. Also, the fact that I'm, since I'm kind of initiating this research, I'm, according to you, I'm kind of on ethically treacherous ground by even trying to do it.
Well,
so I'm highly edgy, which is maybe a compliment. But yeah, it's something to consider the implications of.
yeah, I'm just looking for. We published a paper 2 years ago on aspects of really quite boring interaction. Here, yeah. Quite banal computational task, conversational labeling. And we used interaction with machine interaction that could either be rhythmic or non-rhythmic. And when it was rhythmic, it was basically picking up on its user's rhythmicity. And that led to a bias towards the machine that behaved rhythmically. It was liked better. And the stress, that was, the task was perceived as easier when the machine helped you out by mimicking or aligning with your rhythmic structures.
I will email you for that reference, I think.
Sure. Let me just, actually, I should be able to, can I do this? I might be able to put it into the chat even. Let me just see if I can do that.
Also, there is a comment or a question there if you want to read.
Sure. Here is,
while you're at it.
Is this going to work? Oh, what? Oh, it doesn't seem to want to allow me to do this. How bizarre. Oh well. The reference is, hang on, I'll just open it, and it's, here's the DOI. Nope. I think, yep, that's the reference. Yeah.
And then there is maybe a last question from Jonathan just about that, if you want to.
Yeah, okay. I suspect that it is simply intrinsically affiliative. You really can't have any level of musical engagement without that almost presumption of affiliativeness. And I think it's that idea is one that's evident in many approaches to understanding conversational interaction. You can't actually have a conversation, an interactive conversation, without a presumption of cooperativity, a presumption that interactants expect their actions and their utterances to be transparent to each other. So yeah, I think that we have to start from that presumption.
Great. So thank you very much, Ian, for a wonderful talk. And everybody have a good holiday break. And we are meeting in January, for the beginning of January, for the next one.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you all very much indeed.